Did it always have to be like this? Angela stared at Jim's back and hated him, but the emotion fizzled out like a match that died after flaring briefly into life. They marched along the path through the woods, and she felt hot and sweaty, none of which was doing her patience any good. A walk in the country could have been pleasant enough, but this one wasn't. She wanted only to be back at the hotel, to unwind with a long, lazy shower, and then to relax on the large bed and just rest amongst all that luxury. "Keep up, for God's sake," Jim snapped, barely glancing back at her over his shoulder. And who said romance was dead? Certainly she mourned it. 10 years ago he had been romantic, when he wanted more than anything else just to get her into his bed. More than anything else. More than he now desired promotion, or his damned car, or 3 holidays a year, or his boring investments. She couldn't recall the last romantic gesture he'd made for her. Certainly it should be this holiday for her birthday, but where was the feeling in it? The hotel was expensive, large, and romantic enough by itself in its lonely spot amid the woods on the misty lakeside, but Jim himself acted most of the time like he'd rather be somewhere else. Probably back in his office with his bitch of a secretary, she thought bitterly, and thrashed out at a thicket with her walking stick. She tried to push the image from her mind, but it took its time in leaving. She saw them up against the wall, sprawled across the desk, all fevered and crumpled and passionate, and not at all professional. She wondered if he was as good as he'd been back when they'd first met. Now, his lovemaking, if it could be called such a thing, was half-hearted, lazy, and frustratingly brief. If she was lucky, he might manage it once every weekend, and then it was over in a matter of 10 minutes from start to finish, and he was snoring beside her. Usually, though, he even cried off that, drank too much and couldn't get it up, then blamed the stress of work. She doubted he had such problems with his secretary. She was hot and she was tired, and these thoughts were doing her no good. It was useless, really, thinking like this. She didn't know for a fact that anything was still going on between him and that stuck-up little bitch. There had been. He'd been man enough to admit that to her, at least. It had happened at the Christmas party last year, 9 months ago now, but still the spectre of the event was fresh and painfully vivid in her mind. She wasn't sure why. Things hadn't been great between them for a while, but still it hurt to be so betrayed and taken for granted. If only Jim showed her a little more love and attention, she could be everything that he wanted, everything that he ever needed. She knew that she could, but the way he acted most of the time, she felt like there was no point in trying. Was there any way out of such a situation? Angela gazed up, away from her thoughts, into the foliage all around her. It was good out here, out in the country. Back home she could go for months without seeing a hint of greenery. Here it felt like the opposite, like she could wander for days and days without finding her way back to civilization. All of a sudden, she felt rather cold, pushed the thought from her mind, and found herself hurrying after Jim. He'd stopped 10 yards further on, swearing under his breath. She knew he'd lost his way and was probably about to blame her for it, if he could possibly think of a way to do just that. But he had the guidebook in his hand. They'd found it in their hotel room, a small collection of local walks. He'd ordered them both out into the fresh air, claiming it would be good for them. She wished that he'd just gone off on his own, maybe got lost and left her to mourn his disappearance. No, she told herself sharply, you mustn't think like that. But then why was it so easy? He was about to say something. He turned his head towards her, but his eyes wouldn't look at her. These days they rarely did, and when they did, there was little affection in them. His mouth dropped open. His face looked pale, The tan from Spain had faded, leaving him pasty white, and the blue around his unshaven cheeks reminded her of fish skin. He'd let his hair grow, but it suited him better short. Now it hung over his forehead in sweaty strands, and his eyes had lost their colour. She wondered if he looked at her this way too. His mouth closed, and he shook his head, mumbled something, and stalked off up a narrow path through some thick trees. Birds twittered occasionally. She liked the sound. She wondered if Jim had ever been the sort who could take pleasure in the simple things in life. She wondered how much he enjoyed the taste of the food when they ate out, or the texture of his expensive wines rather than just the prestige. She wondered if he ever looked at trees and plants and animals and smiled with contentment at the world and its diversity. She wondered if he enjoyed the sensual delights of her flesh when they made love, the taste of her mouth when they kissed, the warmth of her body. He stopped dead in his tracks. "Oh God," she groaned inwardly. "What now?" "Listen," he hissed, and she stumbled to a halt a few paces behind him, but he said only, "Can you hear that?" "Hear what?" she asked flatly, not wanting to anger him, but not knowing what on earth he was expecting her to hear. Nothing sounded out of the ordinary to her. She wondered if he was trying to show off some impressive animal tracking skills. Maybe he would stalk off through the bushes, tracking a bear or something equally vicious by his sense of hearing alone. "Voices," he said. "Laughter." And all of a sudden, she could hear it. Somewhere in the near distance, children were laughing and calling out to one another. It sounded like a family at play somewhere, probably a picnic area a little further down the hill. Nothing to be excited about. "It's just children," Angela said, wishing that he'd get bored and they could go back to the hotel. It would be dark within a couple of hours, and Jim wasn't the kind of person she'd like to be trapped out here with in the dark. Years ago, maybe, but definitely not now. He screwed up his face in what looked like a mixture of disgust and concentration. Then he relaxed. So it is. They just sounded, I don't know, somehow different for a moment. She watched him as he recommenced his onward stalk up the hill through the forest. She didn't give another thought at that moment to the children's voices. Right then it seemed so natural that it formed the audible wallpaper of a forest, just like the gentle rustle of the occasional breeze through the foliage, or the fading birdsong as afternoon turned to evening. Angela couldn't find distraction in the rest of the walk. She wanted to lose herself in the peaceful countryside, but everything just seemed to irritate instead of relax her. This oppressive silence, the clammy heat making her aware of her sweat-soaked body beneath her heavy clothing, Jim's moodiness. Even her thoughts couldn't form enough substance to carry her away on some meaningless fantasy. She felt trapped and awkward, and she found herself hating Jim for making her feel this way. "Better set off back," he called out after they'd meandered pointlessly around some lakes secreted in the hills. "It's getting dark about 7. He barely looked at her before stepping past and trudging back the way they'd came. She looked down at her watch. It's about an hour, then. It wasn't dark right now, but the sun could no longer be seen, and the sky had lost its wishy-washy brightness. It now looked muddy and brown, just like the ground beneath her boots. At least she would soon be relaxing back in their room, if he let her. If he didn't insist upon them changing and going down to the restaurant immediately, full of stuffy, boring businessmen and their wives, adorned with trinkets but devoid of personality. If she'd ever had any friends of her own, she'd forgotten what she looked for in them, but knew only that she yearned for people more interesting, less uptight than the crowd her marriage had pushed her into. They wandered along a rocky and narrow path, and foliage pressed up tight on either side. She stifled a yawn, not wanting to make a noise, not wanting to exist. No, she shouldn't go to such extremes. If anything, it was Jim she wished didn't exist, not herself. She stared at his back, wished he'd just vanish somewhere and she'd never hear from him again, and then she could get on with her own life. The intensity of the thought frightened her. She shook herself, marched a little faster after his dwindling figure to try and catch up. He was trudging downhill, shoulders up high, as though trying to fool her into thinking his head had shrunk into his body, as though he were vanishing bit by bit. Don't be stupid, she thought, and then she thought she heard somebody laughing in the bushes off to her left. For a second there was nothing, then an icy coldness washed down her spine, as though somebody had poured water down her back. She marched faster, cast a quick glance off into the bushes, but saw nothing. It was foolish being frightened, wasn't it? So somebody had laughed. What was wrong with that? The laugh had sounded high and childish anyway. There couldn't be anything sinister in that, could there? Something Jim had said earlier replayed itself in her mind, about the children they'd heard somewhere in the forest, about them not sounding right. She tried to clear her head of thoughts and just walked quicker. She'd lost sight of Jim, but he could only be around the next bend in the path, possibly waiting impatiently with an aggressive comment, or more likely just continuing in his moody stomp through the forest without even noticing or caring that she had fallen behind. She came to a gate blocking the path and wished that she had paid more attention to the route on the way here. Had they come through this earlier? They must have done, for there was no other path, only a steep grassy bank plunging downhill into thick bushes. She doubted Jim would have gone down there. Nobody in their right mind would run around in the bushes. The thought made her shiver, and she pushed her way through the gate and along the path. Where the hell was he? She cursed him under her breath and was about to repeat it a little louder, but caught herself just in time. It was unnaturally silent in this part of the forest. Even her own breathing and the swish of her clothing sounded a giveaway. Giveaway to what? She challenged herself, but didn't want an answer to that one. Then, up ahead, she caught sight of Jim's coat through the trees, and she felt a little better. She strode onwards, almost breaking into a jog. Uncomfortably, she became aware of just how dark it was getting in the forest, and how far she still was from the hotel. 100 yards away, darkness was solidifying between the trees, forming an ever-decreasing circle all around her. She stumbled onwards, tree roots bursting through the muddy path as though reaching for her. Angela forced a nervous laugh at her imagination. She felt claustrophobic. Was it possible to feel claustrophobic out in a large forest? A thin stream cut across the path and she stepped over it, casting her eyes downwards briefly. There was a gaping hole in the ground with smooth sides. It looked like a shaft of some kind, but the darkness within it unnerved her. She wanted Jim's company. His gruff manner would reassure her childish nerves right now. But where the hell was he? Where had the fucking bastard run off to? She couldn't believe he just stormed off and left her out here. What? She stopped dead in her tracks. Tears prickled her eyes. What she was seeing didn't look right. Not out here. Not right now. Up ahead, there was a clearing in the forest. The trees fell away to form a small circle, beyond which darkness hung between the branches like a web. Angela stood rigid, her eyes fixed upon the clearing, upon what she saw there. upon the two small huts that had scared her so much. They looked unnatural. She knew that instantly. They looked primitive and ancient, yet at the same time well kept and even lived in. They were both maybe 7 feet high, with rock and mud walls and roofs thatched from dead branches. Crooked doorways and windows presented her only with a view of the deep blackness within. She felt frozen, held there immobile by fear, like a fly trapped in a spider's web, as though she could only wait for something to come scurrying out of the huts to devour her. That did it. She turned on her heels and fled, stumbling over the muddy ground. Some part of her was trying to regain control, to say that it was unwise to run, that she could fall and hurt herself or get lost in her panic, but none of it mattered anymore. She was already lost out here. Jim was gone without her, and she'd become lost, and there was something out here with her. She was sure of it. She felt as though she were losing her mind with fear. If she hadn't seen the huts, it might not have been so bad. Hearing the odd laughter and voices earlier had been bizarre, but could have been easily forgotten. Now it was all she could hear, replaying over and over in her mind. She wanted to yell out for Jim, but her lungs were already at bursting point, just trying to breathe as she fled, and she did not dare to stop running for 1 second. Maybe there was something racing after her, something twisted and dry like the branches, something that scuttled on many long, twisted legs like a spider, something with a high and childish voice, maybe something that stole the voices of those it had devoured. No, she was getting crazy. She had to stop it now or she would go mad out here. Somehow that almost seemed the easy way out, but still she managed to slow her frantic dash a little and get some of her breath back. The stream had gone by behind her and the mysterious shaft in the forest floor. As she'd raced by, she'd seen something long and brown and gnarled reaching out of it, but it was surely just a branch, because it looked dead, and the only thing causing it to move was her distorted view as she ran. Now she was moving uphill again, although the hotel was downhill somewhere, and darkness was gathering all around. She had to find her bearings. She didn't recognize any of her surroundings. A steep rock face peered out of the foliage ahead. She'd do herself some damage if she tried to climb that, and besides which she knew for a fact there'd been nowhere near it on the walk earlier. Angela looked around. Sweat slithered coldly across her body, and the silence of the forest closed in upon her. A breeze lifted from nowhere, brushing her face gently, stinging her crying eyes. "Jim," she breathed, and the breeze blew past her, back into the forest. There was only one thing for it. Little as she liked the idea, and as much like suicide as it felt, she was going to have to head back in the direction of those unnatural huts and try somehow to get past them safely. If she could get all the way downhill, she would be able to find the lakeside easily enough, and then walk along it towards the lights of the hotel. Tonight she would wrap herself in a warm bathrobe and huddle beneath the bedsheets, order up some room service and relax in front of the reassuring banality of a television. She managed to smile and, falteringly, headed back into the darkness. Something was pacing her through the bushes. It had so many legs that it kept racing ahead, then had to wait for her to catch up. It must have been only a breeze, she tried to tell herself. To think anything else was madness. She imagined how Jim would have mocked her imagination, scorned her for being so childish. More than ever she yearned for his company. Even though she felt no love for him, she just needed to see him, to know that, even though she'd wished it, He hadn't really vanished completely. Angela bit down upon her lip harder and harder. What might be attracted out of the ancient darkness by the scent of her blood? Whatever may be, she felt sure that it was already aware of her. There was something in the forest with her, something ancient and alien, something that had always been out here just beyond the reach of the light, something that made its home deep amongst the dead, dry branches. She was almost certain now that she was never going to find her way out of the woods, that she would never see the hotel again. Yet she couldn't give up. She couldn't wait for darkness to fall and for the inhabitant of the forest to come and find her. She had to try, at least. The clearing was just up ahead. She could see a faint mist swirling around it like dry ice, ethereal and ghostly in the thickening shadows. Her eyes were streaming with tears, and her heart was straining with sheer terror, yet she was singing softly under her breath, and her ears were closed to the echoes that sounded like children's voices mimicking hers. If whatever lived out here had done so for so very long, then how many victims had it claimed over the years, over the centuries? She wondered if perhaps it had started off small, if it had first devoured the lesser game of the forest, insects, birds, rodents, until the terror it sucked from its prey had fattened it up, enabling it to move on to bigger and bigger prey. Angela shook her head, then realized that her whole body was shaking as she approached the mist-shrouded clearing. Why was she thinking these things? Was it simply her overactive imagination, fueled by sheer terror? Or was it something more? Was the breeze that ran over her like strands of web somehow acting as the ancient voice of the forest, whispering to her everything that it had seen happen out here, far from civilization? She saw the huts rise out of the mist, squat, bulky shadows. Surely nobody knew that they were out here so deep into the woods. Why had she ever had to see them with her own eyes? Why could she not have been spared this last proof that her life no longer held any hope? But then, she wondered, her thoughts becoming light and breezy as she came closer to accepting her fate. Had it ever? Something was moving about just beyond the doorway of a hut. Just like she'd known it would, its occupant was coming to greet her. Resigned to the fact, she thought that maybe it wouldn't have been so bad if it could have shown her a friendly face amongst all its dead and twisted limbs. But as a familiar voice carried softly across the clearing and merged with a soft, childish laughter that sounded almost like a breeze, she had a dreadful feeling that it would be wearing Jim's.